Good evening and welcome. My name is Stephen Hubbard, and I am the interim head for the Department of Geoscience in the Faculty of Science. It's so wonderful to have you join us online for this evening's Gallagher Colloquium lecture. Today's session is being recorded, and we will be posting this video on the Faculty of Science website. I encourage you to check out our website, science@ucalgary.ca, for event listings and video updates. We are hosting this annual series online this year, which is providing us with a greater opportunity to engage with attendees from around the globe. If our webinar is disconnected before the event ends, please allow a minute or so to reconnect and start things again. You will be able to rejoin the webinar by using your same login link. As we gather this evening, I like to think about who I'm sharing this virtual space with now, both far and near. We are broadcasting from Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. The University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary. Before we begin tonight's presentation, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the Gallagher family for making this series possible. Through their generous philanthropy and vision for deep connection between the university and the community, the Gallagher family has provided the Department of Geoscience and the Faculty of Science with the opportunity to develop and grow the Gallagher Colloquium series. This series serves to strengthen our scientific community by increasing scientific knowledge, creating public awareness, and establishing connections with our alumni, community, students, faculty, and staff. Thank you, Tom and Fred Gallagher, for your continued support of this public lecture series and for being champions of science. The Gallagher Colloquium series continues to be an invaluable way to connect science with our community and our community with science. I would also like to take a moment to extend a sincere thank you to our series lead, Dr. Chris Clarkson, professor in the Department of Geoscience. After 5 years at the helm, Dr. Clarkson will be stepping away from his role as series lead after tonight's event. Since the series began in 2015, Chris has been instrumental in leading and directing the vision for the Gallagher Colloquium series. Under Chris's tenure, this series has welcomed world-class speakers, locally and from around the world, who have shared their passion for science, scientific research, and exploration with our community. Chris was also instrumental in ensuring our students, faculty, and researchers were able to connect with guest speakers. As a result of these efforts, the experience of our graduate students was enriched by the opportunity to discuss the results with world-class scientists that visited our campus for Gallagher events. Over the years, I personally have enjoyed many of the fantastic Gallagher lectures. There is so much diversity in the earth sciences, and to see that highlighted here in this forum is truly something special. It seems there's always something new to consider and be inspired by. For example, tonight, for the first time, I'll be watching with my young son. I think we can all agree you can never start exposing young people to science too early, and what better way than with a topic like dinosaurs. Chris, you have ensured the Gallagher Colloquium series continues to attract global expertise while serving our community. On behalf of the Department of Geoscience and the Faculty of Science, thank you. Thank you, Chris, for your leadership, vision, and commitment. Now, last thing before we begin our program, I need to introduce Dr. Ben Tulo, an assistant professor in the Department of Geoscience. Ben is a geochemist whose research is focused on solving a wide range of problems related to water, rock, atmosphere interactions. In his first few years in the Department of Geoscience, Ben has played an important role in building our community through inviting and arranging visiting speakers. He has worked closely with Professor Clarkson in planning Gallagher Colloquium events and has also taken an important role in recruiting speakers for our Tom Oliver lecture each year. Ben will be taking over the role as the Gallagher Colloquium series lead and is joining us this evening to introduce our first speaker. Welcome, Ben.
All right, thank you, Steve. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here tonight and to participate in this month's Gallagher Colloquium lecture series, where we get to spend a night at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. For all of the budding paleontologists and dinosaur enthusiasts logging in tonight, we have an exciting program designed just for you. I'm so excited about this opportunity for a behind-the-scenes tour of my very favorite museum. Every time I visit the Royal Tyrrell Museum with my family, it's sort of a competition to see whether my wife's going to have to drag me out first or my 5-year-old daughter out first at the end of the day. I haven't been keeping track, but I think more often than not, it's been me that she has to drag out. Now it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague in the Department of Geoscience and tonight's first speaker, Dr. Darla Zawanitsky. Darla Zawanitsky is an associate professor in the Department of Geoscience at the University of Calgary and is the principal dinosaur researcher and an absolute rock star at that. Dr. Zawanitsky received her bachelor degree in geoscience from the University of Manitoba and her master's and PhD in geoscience from the University of Calgary. Following her graduate studies, she received an Alberta Ingenuity postdoctoral fellowship and a Killam postdoctoral fellowship, which supported her collaboration between the University of Calgary and the Royal Tyrrell Museum, a collaborative relationship that obviously continues today. Darla's research interests lie mainly in advancing our knowledge of the biology and evolution of theropods, which are those dinosaurs that ultimately led to the origin of birds. During her research career, she has conducted field and museum work in Canada, China, France, Japan, Mongolia, South Africa, South Korea, and the United States. Over the past several years, Dr. Zawanitsky has been involved in numerous fascinating and scientifically important discoveries, including the first discovered gravid or pregnant dinosaur in 2005, the first discovered feathered dinosaurs from the Americas in 2012, naming the giant bird-like dinosaur Bei Long, Baby Louie, from China in 2017, and in 2020, earlier this year, discovering the first known reptilian-like eggs in dinosaurs. We are very excited Darla has chosen to spend her evening sharing her passion for dinosaurs as part of our Night at the Royal Tyrrell Museum event. Welcome, Dr. Darla Zawanitsky.
Thank you for the introduction, Ben. And thank you for joining us, everyone, tonight. Tonight, you'll be hearing from two special guests from the Royal Tyrrell Museum, who are both paleontologists and curators at the museum. But before I introduce them, I'd just like to give you a very brief history of dinosaur research in Alberta. And I'm just going to share my screen. So we are very fortunate in Alberta, as I'm sure many of you know, to have so many dinosaur fossils. We have some of the richest deposits in the world in the Badlands along the Red Deer and South Saskatchewan rivers, in places like Dinosaur Provincial Park and the Drumheller area. And I'm sure many of you have visited these areas in the past. There's almost 100 species of dinosaurs that have been found in Alberta. And the latest species named was this one here, Thanatothyristes dugratorum, in early 2020. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a large meat-eating dinosaur, as you can see. And this was a collaborative effort between my student, Jared Boris, myself, and our two guest speakers tonight, Drs. Therrien and Brown from the Royal Tyrrell Museum. So dinosaur research in Alberta has really intensified in the past 40 years. And this, I think, is for a few different reasons. So firstly, in the late 1970s, Alberta took measures to protect our fossils for the people of the province. And prior to this, most dinosaur fossils here were excavated and then sent out of the province to museums in Eastern Canada or to museums in other countries. And these are some of the old pictures in the field in Dinosaur Provincial Park that you're seeing here. And secondly, the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology was actually built as an official repository for fossils in the province. And the Royal Tyrrell opened its doors in 1985. And finally, universities in Alberta began training and hiring dinosaur paleontologists. And the University of Calgary has had a strong working relationship with the Royal Tyrrell Museum since shortly after it opened in 1985. And Dr. Philip Curry, seen here, he was then head of dinosaurs and he was the founder of the Tyrrell Museum. He became an adjunct professor in the Department of Geoscience at the U of C in 1987. And for over 20 years, he had officially and unofficially trained students, including myself, through the University of Calgary. So Dr. Curry left the Tyrrell Museum to take a position at the U of A in 2005, but his scientific impact is apparent throughout the museum still, and his impact on the training of students at Alberta universities as well is evident. Many students, including myself at the time, have benefited greatly from interacting with Dr. Curry, as he is an exceptional paleontologist and individual. So currently there are 3 curators at the Royal Tyrrell Museum who are actively working on dinosaurs, which is magnificent because when Dr. Curry was at the museum, there was only one, and that was him. And so we have 2 of those 3 joining us tonight as guest speakers. Now, one of them is actually an alumnus of the University of Calgary, and the other is an adjunct professor in geoscience, and both have been involved, like Dr. Curry was, in training students here at the U of C. So our first speaker will be Dr. Therrien, who is originally from Montreal, Quebec. He obtained an undergraduate degree in geology at the University of Montreal. He then moved to the US to pursue a master's degree in geoscience at the University of Rhode Island. And for his thesis, Dr. Therrien studied the paleoenvironments in which late Triassic theropod dinosaurs lived in the American Southwest. And subsequently, Dr. Therrien moved to Baltimore, Maryland to pursue his PhD in functional anatomy and evolution at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And for his dissertation, he studied the paleoenvironments of the late Cretaceous dinosaur-bearing formations of Romania. And after a PhD, Dr. Therrien went to the Royal Tyrrell Museum as an NSERC postdoctoral fellow and became a curator in 2006. Dr. Therrien's primary research interests involved the study of late Cretaceous faunal and environmental changes, as well as the study of dinosaur behavior. And over the years, he has conducted field research in Canada, the US, Romania, and Mongolia. And our second speaker tonight is Dr. Caleb Brown, who is curator of dinosaur systematics and evolution at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. And Dr. Brown is originally from northeastern British Columbia, but grew up in Red Deer, Alberta. And he received his BSc in zoology from the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Calgary, and spent 3 summers during his undergraduate years working in the preparation lab at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. After completing a BSc, he remained at the U of C to pursue his master's degree, where he investigated the diversity of small plant-eating dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous of Canada. After successfully defending his thesis, Dr. Brown pursued a PhD in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. And for his dissertation, he studied the variation and evolutionary morphology in horned dinosaurs from Dinosaur Provincial Park. And after completing his PhD, Dr. Brown moved to Dromheller to hold the Betsy Nichols postdoctoral fellowship at the museum, and then became a curator recently in 2019. Dr. Brown's research interests focus primarily on the evolution of dinosaurs, particularly the horned dinosaurs, and over the years, he has conducted fieldwork in Alberta, Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, China, and Mongolia. So with that introduction, I will pass the session on to Dr. Therrien, who will give us a brief tour of the Royal Tyrrell Museum and a presentation on feeding behavior in the meat-eating dinosaurs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Darla, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you about the museum. As Darla mentioned, the Royal Tyrrell Museum first opened its doors 35 years ago, 2 months ago. The museum is the official fossil repository for the province of Alberta, and has been the flagship of paleontological research in Western Canada for several decades. With nearly 170,000 specimens in its collections, the Royal Tyrrell Museum is the largest museum dedicated to paleontology in Canada and one of the largest in the world. Every year, the museum welcomes close to 450,000 people coming through the doors, which makes it the second most year-round visited tourist destinations in Alberta after Banff National Park. As the museum has changed a lot over the years, and some of you may not have been to the museum recently, I thought that I'd give you a little walkthrough of the galleries. So visitors, when they come to the museum, they're first welcomed by this beautiful diorama called Cretaceous Alberta. This diorama illustrates the ultimate goal of the science of paleontology, which is to reconstruct the world and the lifestyle of extinct animals based on scientific evidence. Everything in this diorama that you see there, from the dinosaurs to the plants to the landscapes and even to the little critters hidden in the trees and the ponds, is based on fossil and geological evidence preserved at a fossil site situated about an hour north of Dromiosaurus, a site called the Ebillosaurids bone bed. Following the Cretaceous Alberta, visitors walk through our Foundations Gallery, where the basic concepts of geology, biology, and evolution that are at the core of the science of paleontology are introduced. Subsequently, visitors walk through our Grounds for Discovery Gallery, which is a temporary gallery that features some of the amazing scientific discoveries that have been made by the industry, whether it's construction, mining, oil and gas. And Caleb will talk about the centerpiece of that gallery in his presentation a little later. Visitors then climb a ramp to the second floor of the building, and along that ramp, they can see the Perspectives Gallery, an ever-changing gallery that features photographs and illustrations related to specific paleontological topics. Currently, the Perspective Gallery showcases the work of the museum's scientific illustrator, the very talented Mrs. Donna Sloan, and features some of the amazing illustrations of fossil specimens that she's drawn for various scientific illustrations. Then the rest of the museum is arranged like a time tunnel where visitors travel back in time in order to see how life forms change through the eons and in the eras of Earth's history. The first stop along the way is a diorama for the Burgess Shale fauna, which represents the strange soft-bodied life forms that lived at the bottom of the ocean about 515 million years ago in what is today Yoho National Park in BC. These extremely strange life forms, which represent the distant ancestors of the major animal groups alive today, are magnified 11 times their original size so the public can better appreciate them. Visitors then enter a brand new gallery that opened less than 2 years ago. This gallery tells the story of life in the oceans during the Paleozoic era, the time before the age of the dinosaurs. And in this gallery, we have a strong emphasis on the evolution of vertebrates, animals with backbones, with a particular emphasis on fish. Then, prior to going back down to the first floor of the building, visitors can take a rest in a brand new gallery that opened just last year called the Learning Lounge. This new gallery is full of interactive kiosks where visitors can interact with computer screens and replicas of fossils in order to better understand the life of a large meat-eating dinosaur called Albertosaurus. Unfortunately, this gallery is currently closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but it will reopen when things return to normal. Visitors then continue their tour on the first floor of the building, and then they start looking at the terrestrial Paleozoic, the history of life on land in the age before the dinosaurs. So in this gallery, they learn about the evolution of land plants, insects, and the amazing diversity of vertebrate animals that lived on land before the origin of dinosaurs. Many people may not be aware, but there is a small botanical garden at the Royal Tyrrell Museum called the Paleoconservatory. This garden showcases the fossils of plants that lived in Alberta during the Cretaceous, alongside close living relatives of those plants. After exiting the conservatory, visitors then begin their journey through the Mesozoic, the age of the dinosaurs. And the first stop is next to the skeleton of the largest marine reptile to have ever lived. It's an Ichthyosaur that's the size of a whale, that exceeded 20 meters in length, and that lived in BC during the late Triassic, at the time when the first dinosaurs started colonizing the continents and conquering the world. Then after this Triassic giants, visitors truly enter the heart of the museum, which is the Dinosaur Hall. In Dinosaur Hall, nearly 40 mounted skeletons of dinosaurs tell the story of how dinosaur species changed through time, with a strong emphasis on species that lived here in Alberta. In pre-COVID times, the museum would often host school groups and children who would come camp and spend a night at the feet of the mighty T-Rex. Unfortunately, this program had to be canceled due to the pandemic, but will resume when things return to normal. And then finally, I'd like to give you, offer you a sneak peek at the brand new galleries that are just opening now at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. The first one is a brand new, updated, renovated gallery dedicated to the extinction of the dinosaurs, telling the story of what happened 66 million years ago to cause the extinction of those fascinating creatures. And then after that, visitors will go through a brand new Cenozoic gallery, relating the fascinating story of the evolution of mammals after the age of the dinosaurs. So this new gallery, which is scheduled to open in the next couple of weeks, will feature some brand new skeletal mounts, as you can see through the archway, as well as some never before seen dioramas of the age of mammals. But the Royal Tyrrell Museum is more than just public galleries. What makes a museum is the scientific research that happens behind the scenes. So here I'll take you behind those silver doors that are marked authorized personnel only, in order to show you the magic that happens behind the scenes. So our first stop is in our storage facility called the Unprepared Collections. And that's where all the blocks and the plaster jackets that contain the skeletons of dinosaurs that are collected each year are stored while awaiting to be opened. And then those jackets are brought into the preparation lab, where we have half a dozen technicians that slave away at opening those jackets, using a variety of tools, from scalpel blades to dental picks to mini jackhammers, to break away the rock and expose the dinosaur bones that are preserved inside the blocks, so that scientists like Caleb and myself can come and study them. And then after the fossils have been fully prepared and extracted out of the blocks, they're brought into our collections facility, where they are stored for posterity. There, the fossils can wait to eventually go on display for public viewing, or they can await the visit of researchers who come from all over the world to come study those specimens and share their results with the general public through scientific publications. As I mentioned earlier, what makes a museum is scientific research. And at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, we have half a dozen scientists that are on staff and conducting active research on various aspects of paleontology. You can see here that there's lots of researchers that focus on dinosaurs, and this makes sense given that Alberta is so blessed with the great abundance of dinosaur fossils we have. But we also have other researchers that work on other topics, such as fossil amphibians, fossil mammals, marine reptiles, as well as turtle and fish. And here what I'll talk about is a little bit about the type of research that I do at the museum, which is called dinosaur paleoecology. So my research interest revolves around reconstructing the climate and the habitats in which extinct animals lived, especially dinosaurs, but also trying to figure out what was the impact of climate change on dinosaur diversity in the millions of years leading to their extinction 66 million years ago. And that aspect of research involves a lot of geology, studying the rocks in which the bones are preserved. But for examples of research that I'm conducting, I'd rather here focus on the third line of research that I do, which is study the behavior of extinct predators, specifically the big mighty theropods or meat-eating dinosaurs. Feeding behavior and bite force of meat-eating dinosaurs have been the topic of great interest to scientists, but also to the general public. And there's lots of theories or hypotheses surrounding what was their feeding behaviors? How did they go about to capture their prey? A lot of scientists have proposed that we should look at modern reptiles in order to get an idea of how they could hunt. And the biggest living reptiles nowadays are the Komodo dragons and crocodiles. So some researchers believe that theropods may have hunted a little bit like Komodo dragons, being ambush predators that sneak up on their prey, come close, then deliver slashing bites, meaning that they just bite and release their prey. They don't hold down onto it. And then they just back away and wait for their prey to get weaker, either due to disease, blood loss, or fatigue. And then when the prey is too tired to defend itself, that's when the theropods would come in for the kill. Then there's also some researchers that believe that maybe big theropods were more like big cats, ambush predators. Lots of them are solitary hunters, and they would just hunt down the prey, bite down on it, and try to subdue it and drag it down. Unfortunately, it's hard to determine which of those scenarios is possible because these animals are long dead. But there's a possibility to answer this, or at least start to answer those questions by looking at the bones of their skulls. And that's the type of research that I've done by looking at how the lower jaws of these theropods were designed. So we can apply different mathematical models to see how the lower jaw of a theropod is adapted. Is it adapted for sustaining torsional stresses? Is it adapted for delivering powerful bites? So what we did in that line of research, we took measurements along the lower jaw of the theropods, and then we inserted those measurements in a series of mathematical models. Here, this slide is just to give you an idea that paleontology is a science. It's not only about looking at pretty bones and then telling stories. Because it is a science, it involves math, whether it's statistics, some biomechanical modeling, or some very complicated math like computer modeling. It does involve a little bit of those fields in research. So here, those equations are actually a very simple model. If I can do it, anyone can. And this gets a very simple method that allows you to transfer the dimensions of a jaw into bite force measurements or adaptations of a jaw for sustaining pressures or stresses. So I looked at a series of different theropods, and we found that actually theropods did not fit into a single mold. There were several different types of theropods that hunted differently. One group of theropods that we studied actually were a perfect match for Komodo dragons. And that group of theropods are called the Ebillosaurids. They're a group of enigmatic theropods, medium size, about 8 to 9 meters long, that lived in the southern continents of Gondwana during the Cretaceous. And these animals are, as I mentioned, they're medium in size, 8 to 9 meters in length. But what's really strange about them is they have very short forelimbs, as you can see in the lower left of the slide. A little bit like T-Rex, they have very short forelimbs that probably they could not use to grasp and hold onto prey. So they had to use their jaws in order to kill their prey. And given that Ebillosaurids were animals that lived alongside large sauropods, long-necked herbivores that were as big, if not bigger than themselves, probably since you can't slash and grasp at it with your forelimbs, the best approach if you're a predator is to deliver slashing bites. Bite your prey, back off, and then wait for it to get weak due to blood loss or infection. And then when it's too weak to defend itself, that's when the predator comes in for the kill. So that's probably what those Ebillosaurids did. They hunted just like Komodo dragons. Then the second group of theropods that we identified are the famous raptors of the Jurassic Park movies, the animals that we call Dromiosaurids. And these animals also had fairly simple jaws that was probably not the main weapon to kill their prey. But if you look at the raptors, you know that they have big hands with big claws, but also their main weapon is that very terrifying sickle claw that they bore on the inner toe of their feet. So that was probably the big weapon that they used to kill their prey. So you can imagine these animals jumping onto their prey, slashing at it with their hands, but also with their sickle claw on their feet, and try to kill their prey that way. And there's some hypotheses that have suggested that Dromiosaurs or raptors could have been pack hunters, like what you've seen in Jurassic Park. Although there's still debate, there's still not consensus in the scientific community that raptors were truly pack hunters. But if they did, it would have been a good way to take down large prey. Then we have some theropods that were generalists. Their jaws are designed a little bit like the jaws of modern alligators, which are generalists. They eat a little bit of everything. And examples of those theropods are Allosaurus and Ceratosaurus, two medium-sized theropods that lived during the late Jurassic. So these animals may have been generalists because they lived during the golden age of the dinosaurs. It was the time of the large sauropods that were ruling the earth, but also there were lots of medium-sized dinosaurs like stegosaurs, Camptosaurus, but also lots of small bipedal ornithischian prey. So maybe those theropods, instead of specializing in a specific type of prey, they just decided to keep their options open and become generalists so they could take advantage of a little bit of everything. And then we move on to a group of theropods that here they started specializing, and those are large prey hunters. They include animals such as Giganotosaurus, one of the largest predator to have ever existed. It's estimated to have been about 13 meters in length, which is essentially bigger than a T-Rex. And the big difference with T-Rex here is these animals have long forelimbs, so they could use their hands with big sharp claws to take down their prey. And it may not be surprising that living alongside the largest predators to have ever existed, live the largest prey or the largest land-dwelling animals to have ever existed. Giganotosaurus lived alongside Argentinosaurus, the largest sauropod to have ever lived, at approximately 40 tons in mass. So it's not really surprising that when you have a big predator, it will go after very large prey, although maybe not fully grown Argentinosaurus, but at least some of those large individuals of the species. Then we have the opposite. We have predators that specialize at capturing small prey. And that includes animals that we call the Spinosaurs. So animals that were crocodile mimics. If you look at their skulls, you can see that they have a very long snout like a crocodile. The jaw is very simple, but the tip of the snout is specialized to withstand torsional stresses associated with biting and holding onto a prey. Indeed, if you look at the tip of the snout, you can see there's a notch in the upper jaw, and that notch is surrounded by teeth that point towards it from all directions. So you can see that if that predator was to seize a small prey with the tip of its snout, it would be impaled by teeth coming from all directions when it closed its mouth. And indeed, if we look at Spinosaurs, we see that a lot of them lived close to big rivers where there were lots of fish. And some of those predators, such as the famous Spinosaurus, have even been suggested to be semi-aquatic. Maybe not fully aquatic, there's still some debate about that, but at least semi-aquatic. They would have spent a lot of time by the side of the rivers or in the rivers, and they would have captured fish. Some of the fish in those rivers were up to 2 or 3 meters in length. So it's a big fish, but for an animal that's over 10 meters in length, it's relatively small compared to the size of the predators. So the teeth and the jaws of the Spinosaurs are perfectly suited for holding and seizing small prey like fish. Then finally, the last group we recognized are everybody's favorites, the Tyrannosaurs. I call them the head hunters, not because they ate the heads of other dinosaurs, but because they use their heads to kill their prey. As everybody knows, T-Rex and its close relatives have very short forelimbs, so short that they could not grasp and hold onto their prey. So this means that they had to do the killing with their jaws. And because the animals, the potential prey of T-Rex were all roughly its own size, the best method in that for these predators was to actually bite down and hold onto their prey and even twist it around, maybe try to snap their necks, just like what many crocodiles do today. So that's why their jaws are very, very strongly adapted to withstand important major torsional stresses associated with biting down and holding on onto their prey. So after looking at recognizing all those different feeding categories, we decided to have a little bit of fun and try to figure out if we could see differences in the bite force of those various predators. As I mentioned earlier in the slide when I showed the mathematical equations, that's a very simple mathematical approach to estimating bite force. So I can't offer a bite force estimate in absolute terms, for example, in pounds per square inches or per Newton. So I can't derive a value like that, but we can derive a relative estimate compared to, say, a modern alligator, and then say how much stronger was the bite of T-Rex relative to that of a modern alligator. So we went through all of our theropods and we started coming up with bite force estimates. So we saw that the raptors of Jurassic Park had a weak bite force. They had a bite force about 10 to 25% that of an alligator. This in itself is not really surprising because raptors are actually small animals. They're much smaller than what you've seen in the Jurassic Park movies. Most raptors were only 2.5, 3 meters long and maybe a meter tall at the hip. So they're a very small animal. Therefore, it's not really surprising that their bite force was actually weaker than that of an alligator. The largest alligators can reach 4 meters in length. The second group that we estimated bite force are the generalists, like Allosaurus, and also the crocodile mimic, like the Spinosaurs. Those had a bite force that was on par with that of a modern alligator, which is actually quite impressive because alligators do have a very powerful bite. Then we found that our Ebillosaurids, the Komodo dragon wannabes, actually had slightly stronger bite force. They could have a bite that was twice as strong as that of a modern alligator. Then, maybe not surprisingly, we found a species that hunted on large prey, like Giganotosaurus, that hunted on gigantic sauropods, had a bite force that was much higher, about 4 times that of an alligator. So that's getting high up there in terms of bite force. But if you look at that list there, you can see that there's one character that's missing that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's T-Rex. And you'll see that its bite force is truly out of this world. Basically, the bite force of T-Rex is estimated to have been 15 times that of an alligator. So it clearly shows that T-Rex and the Tyrannosaurs were a class of their own. They were doing things differently than all other theropods, and that's because they used their jaws to do the killing. And the theropod that Darla mentioned earlier, the Reaper of Death, Thanatotherystes, would fall in with T-Rex slightly lower at about 7 times that of an alligator, but still it shows that T-Rex and its close relatives all had very powerful bites. And some of those Tyrannosaurs like T-Rex, for example, had a bite that was so powerful that they could pulverize bones with their bite, with their teeth. So the next time you watch the Jurassic Park movies and you see that scene where Spinosaurus comes in for a fight with T-Rex and then ends up killing T-Rex, well, now you know that you can't believe everything that you see on TV, because in reality, this probably would have been what happened with a bite force 15 times superior to that of Spinosaurus. T-Rex would have easily won that fight. And then I will conclude just giving you a little bit of a sneak peek of a collaborative project I've been doing with Darla Zawanitsky and one of her students, Jared Voris. We decided to look at how bite force changes during the lifespan of a tyrannosaur. So we looked at two species of tyrannosaurs called Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus, which have a very good sample. We have lots of fossils from individuals going from small body size, about a skull length of about 35 centimeters, individuals that were 2 or 3 years old, all the way to fully grown adults that had a skull over 1 meter in length and were probably in their 20s at the time of death. So we decided by, again, looking at the lower jaw, try to estimate the bite force of each of these individuals to see how bite force changed during their growth. And we discovered that the bite force of those theropods increased exponentially. So this means that initially the increase in bite force was very, very slow in young individuals. But then there comes a threshold when the individual reached about a skull length of 60 centimeters. That's when bite force started increasing dramatically. And that coincides with other changes in the skull becoming more robust, more solidly built, changes in the teeth. So we think that all of these together, the change in bite force, the change in skull anatomy, the change in the teeth, is all indicative of what we call a dietary shift. So this means the diet of these animals changed during their lives. Very early on, they probably captured small prey that had no defense and were easy to catch. But later on, when they entered what we call the late juvenile stage, that's when they started hunting or going after duck-billed dinosaurs and horned dinosaurs and the armored dinosaurs. So that's at that point that their diet changed. So that's really interesting results, and we'll have more results to present shortly. So with this concludes my part, and I'll turn over the mic to Dr. Brown so he can present some of his research that he's been doing here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Francois. And thank you for inviting me here to present this evening. I'm going to take a bit of a different approach to Francois's talk. Instead of looking at the meat-eating dinosaurs, I'm going to be looking at an example of one of the plant-eating dinosaurs. And I'm also going to be following one specimen from its discovery through kind of some of its preparation and some aspects of its research, showing you all the different aspects of research that we can get from one exceptional specimen. As Darla mentioned briefly, Alberta has some of the most proactive fossil legislation in the world, and this is called the Historical Resources Act. And what it means is that fossils are considered historical resources. And ever since 1978, all fossils found in the province belong to the Crown and right of Alberta, which means that they're available for scientific research, which is actually a great opportunity. And it means that excavation of these fossils requires a research permit. Now, there's also a lot of industry happening in Alberta, and a lot of this industry disturbs Cretaceous bedrock. And that Cretaceous bedrock often has amazing fossils in it. So industry works within the Historical Resource Act to ensure protection of those fossils. So when an industry finds a fossil, it's reported to the museum, and we act very quickly to send a team out to assess the situation and collect it as quickly as possible. And this collaboration has worked so well that we have a number of really exciting discoveries over the years that have come from industry finds from all over Alberta. This includes footprints from Grand Cache, great mammals from near Red Deer, marine reptiles from up near Fort McMurray. So much so that one of our galleries, as François mentioned, is called Grounds for Discovery, and it specifically focuses on specimens that have been found by industry and the results of that collaboration and what those specimens can reveal about these animals in terms of making them available for research. So it's in that context that this specimen was sent to the museum in March of 2011. And this was from one of the oil sands mines up near Fort McMurray. And this represents a fossil that was found through the excavation process there. These are the finders. Sean Funk there on the left was the guy who was actually using a heavy excavator to remove overburden down to the layer that has the petroleum. And he was very observant and was able to see from his viewpoint high up that he hit something that was different. It was a bit harder, the color was a bit different, the shape was a bit different, and it turned out to be the remains of this incredible dinosaur. So our team responded very quickly. With the help of Suncor, we sent a crew up and assessed the situation. And just to give you an idea of what Sean was seeing that day, he had to have very good eyesight and good credit to be able to find this thing working so far above the active face in which he's excavating through. So when our team arrived on the site, we were quickly able to determine that this was a bit different. So the rocks that are being dug up are from the early Cretaceous, and they're marine rocks. So they preserve the bottom of a Cretaceous seaway. In this case, what you see, all these kind of orange polka dot-like structures there, those are things called osteoderms. So osteoderms are bones that are preserved in the skin. And right away, that means that this is not a marine animal like an ichthyosaur or a plesiosaur that have been found before at this site. This is a dinosaur, and this is an armored dinosaur. So all of a sudden, we already have something new from this site, so we're very excited. And pretty quickly, we realized two things that were a bit exceptional about this specimen. The first was its level of preservation. So here's just a chunk from the animal, but I'm going to highlight some of the features. So the stuff highlighted there in the reddish brown color, those are the ossified tendons. So those are tendons that go alongside the vertebrae, and these things in the middle here, that's the backbone of the vertebrae. What this means is that the animal is what we call articulated. So it's in life position, which is exactly how we want to find these things because that's where the most information is preserved. The other thing to note is that those osteoderms, those yellow things, they're in place, which means that the armor that surrounds the animal is still in its original place, which is great because usually those are all separate and we lose a lot of that information. But it's not just the bones that we have preserved in this case. If you look in the top left there, you can see these kind of diagonal and octagonal dark gray scales. Those are actually scales. Those are the skin of the animal that is preserved. So right away, we know we have exceptional preservation. We have some of the soft tissue there. And also in the bottom left here, we have this kind of blob, this weird colored stuff. It's located kind of in the stomach area. It might be stomach contents. So right away, we knew this thing was going to be a really exceptional specimen. The second reason why it was so important was because of where it comes from in time and space. So this is just a chart showing different geological formations in Alberta. And I'm just going to zoom in and look at the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic portion of this. And as Darla mentioned, we have a great data set, a great natural resource of dinosaur fossils here in the province. But most of that is actually quite restricted. It's restricted to a set of rocks in the late Cretaceous and in kind of south and central Alberta, the Belly River group and equivalents, and the Edmonton group and equivalents. Now, we've worked really hard in the last several decades to expand that out. We've expanded a bit to the north, we've expanded into the foothills a bit, and expanded back in time into the Milk River Formation. But we still, our data is really heavily biased towards that, those really well sampled things in the Belly River group and in the Edmonton group. This specimen comes from much earlier. It comes from the early Cretaceous, and it comes from northern Alberta. So all of a sudden, right away, it's 400 kilometers north of these other dinosaur locations, and it's about 35 million years older. And we don't have anything of similar age for dinosaurs. So right away, we know this thing is going to be something, probably something new and something very exciting. So the specimen was brought back to the museum, and it was put in the hands of this gentleman, Mark Mitchell. He's one of our amazing technicians at the museum. And his job is to slowly and carefully remove the rock down to the surface of the bone and get it ready for research and get it ready for display. And Mark is very skilled. Here's just a kind of a series of 6 different photographs showing his work exposing the skull of this animal. And you can see the skull in its entirety on that final slide. He's also very patient. He started working on this in April of 2011. He finished in December of 2016. So he spent about 5.5 years working on not much else other than getting this specimen prepared, about 7,000 hours. So a huge commitment of his time to make this available for research and for display. And at the end, we have a beautifully preserved armored dinosaur. So this specimen is amazing for 2 main reasons. First off, it has skin covering the entire surface of the body. It has scales. It has what are called keratinous sheath, which is like a fingernail-like material that covers those osteoderms. And it's also preserved in 3 dimensions. Most dinosaur specimens are kind of squashed flat. This one's still 3D. So all you kind of have to do is squint your eyes a bit, and you can get an idea of what this thing actually looked like back in the Cretaceous. Here's a view from above looking at the specimen. And just to put it in context, that little block I showed you at the very beginning, that fits on right here in kind of the hip region of that animal. And it really shows how those osteoderms fit into the rest of the skeleton. And we can map out the different tissues that are preserved. And I mentioned there is a lot of soft tissue preserved. So the dark brown color here, that's what we call the endoskeleton. That's the internal skeleton. That's normally what you see when you see a dinosaur skeleton. That's all there is. In this case, you can't actually see much of it because it's covered in other stuff. That other stuff is osteoderms. Those are the light yellow stuff. And again, that's those bits of bone embedded in the skin that likely functioned as some form of body armor. But even more important than that, all of the dark gray and all of the medium gray, that is skin and horn-like tissue that covers those osteoderms. So we learn a lot more about the types of tissue that don't normally preserve in this particular specimen. Now, normally when we find a new specimen from a different area, there's a couple of different questions that we can ask, and there's kind of a hierarchy in terms of the scientific questions. And some of the first questions that we can ask are, is this something new? Is it a new species? What is it related to? And what does it say about the evolution of this group? And these kind of fall into this broad category of taxonomy and systematics. And we can answer some of those questions for this animal. It is something new. It comes from a different place and time, and it's morphologically different than other armored dinosaurs. And we gave it the name Borealopelta markmitchelli, which basically means Mark Mitchell's northern shield. And this is a tribute to Mark Mitchell, who spent those 5.5 years committed to making the specimen available for research. We're also able to use various analyses to see what other animals this particular specimen is related to. And that can tell us about the evolution of the osteoderms and the evolution of armor in this group. I don't expect you to take all the details of here. I'm just trying to put it in some context. And we can also look at the evolution of some shape of some of the cranial characters and the evolution of some of those dermal plates on the skull as well. But the really exciting thing with this particular specimen is that we can go beyond that. Because it is so well preserved, we can start to reconstruct some aspects of its color, some aspects of its armor, some aspects of its diet. And this really gets into kind of the behavior and the paleoecology of the animal, some really exciting questions. So all of this research has been published fairly recently. The research on the color and the research on the armor were published back in 2017. And I'm not really going to cover those here. What I'm really going to delve into is the diet. This is relatively new research that was published earlier this year in the journal Royal Society Open Science. And this nicely complements Francois's talk about diet in carnivores. Now we're going to talk about diet in herbivores. So here's a photograph from above looking down on the specimen. And there's this weird blob of stuff kind of in its hip area. Here's a zoomed in view. You can see it's surrounded by this black halo. There's a light gray matrix with these orange and yellow and white spheres. We can map out where this occurs, get an idea for its relative placement and its relative volume, and ask the question, well, does this actually represent stomach contents? And that's a really important question because we actually don't have a lot of direct evidence about what dinosaurs ate, at least what herbivorous dinosaurs ate. It's very rare to find stomach contents for dinosaurs. There's only been about 9 published reports that suggest that the dinosaur stomach contents have been found for herbivores. And this has been across a variety of groups. The unfortunate thing is that most of those don't actually hold up through time. They just happen to be kind of clusters of plants near a skeleton, but there's not really a lot of compelling evidence to suggest that it actually is stomach contents. And in some cases, when they are defensively stomach contents, they don't actually tell you a lot about what the animal ate. In most cases, it just reveals fragments of leaves, bits of plants, but it doesn't actually tell you anything diagnostic about what its diet might have been. And this is actually a really important question because most of what we know about herbivory, especially mega herbivory, large animals that feed on plants, is based on mammals that have evolved in a very different environment than the dinosaurs. So this is just a geological timescale showing the diversity of different plant groups. And most things that we think about as large herbivores today grew up in environments dominated by flowering plants and dominated by grasslands. Now, grasslands didn't exist at all in the Cretaceous, and flowering plants were just getting started back in the early Cretaceous. You can see kind of where our Borealopelta specimen fits on this map, on this chart here. And in terms of the dominant forms of foliage available, it would be ferns, cycads, and conifers. And there's not a lot of large herbivores that feed on ferns and feed on cycads or conifers today. They're hard to digest and they don't have a lot of nutrients compared to angiosperms. So it's a really interesting question of how did so many large herbivorous dinosaurs evolve eating stuff that's very different from what mammals eat today. So if we can figure out and put some constraints on what they were actually eating, we can figure out how this pattern actually evolved. But first we need to assess, are these actually stomach contents? And try to quantify that some way. So myself and my co-authors, we delved into literature and we looked at examples of criteria that would be useful to showcase if something is stomach contents or if it's not. So for example, one example here, number 2, is the material located within the 3-dimensional body cavity. So in blue here we have Xiphactinus, which is a fossil fish. And inside of those ribs, there's a smaller fish. So it looks like that's a pretty strong evidence that that might be stomach contents. Another example is, are they associated with gastroliths? So gastroliths are rocks that the animal swallowed during life, probably to aid in digestion. And in red here, we have a great example of a plesiosaur, a marine reptile that swallowed these rocks. So we know that those rocks would have been held in the stomach. So if there's other material there mixed with those rocks, it's a good example that that material would have been ingested as well. So in total, we have about 16 of these criteria. We can apply those to all those previous suggestions that these were stomach contents across different dinosaur specimens. And at the bottom there, you kind of have a report card of how many they got right, how many criteria support this conclusion that these are stomach contents. And most of them don't do well. There's only one that actually gets above 50%. But let's throw our specimen on here. This is where Borealopelta fits. And it gets almost everything. It hits almost all the criteria. The only ones it misses are the fact that it doesn't have a criterion for a meat-eating criterion, so it's not actually applicable. And we didn't actually look for geochemical evidence of enzymes. So hopefully we'll be able to get some of that evidence in the future. The other thing to consider is that if we look at the first place and the second place contenders here for stomach contents, the second place one is called Camberosaurus, which is from the early Cretaceous of Australia. And if we put these two specimens side by side, up top we have Borrelopelta, on the bottom we have Camberosaurus, we see that the placement, the relative size of the purported stomach contents is nearly identical. And it's also slightly to the left of the body, which is exactly where you'd expect the stomach to be. So there's lots of independent lines of evidence that suggest that, yes, these are possibly stomach contents, at least the best purported evidence so far. So now that we think that these are stomach contents, what do they actually say about the diet? Well, many of you guys are familiar with histology. Basically, we take chunks of these rock, we embed it in a hard resin, we take slices of it, and then we polish that down till it's translucent and look at it under the microscope. And it really allows us to see what's inside of those, inside of that material at a microscopic scale. We made 7 of these slides in different areas just to see kind of how consistent this pattern was across that stomach material. And the first thing to do is kind of map it out and look at the relative components. What makes up this blob that might be stomach contents? Well, about half of the surface area is gastroliths. You can see that highlighted with the orange there. About a quarter is matrix, so it's just a smaller rock that's between the gastroliths. And about 13% of that is the plants. And it's really well preserved plant material. And that's what we're excited about, because that's the diet that we're trying to get evidence for. So let's look at what those plants look like. Here's an example of a close-up view. The best way I can describe this is if you took a Cretaceous forest and you put it in a blender, this is basically what you see here. There's a whole bunch of different plant types and a whole bunch of different plant tissues all mixed together. And this is kind of exactly what we'd expect. Just to show you some examples, this is a longitudinal section through a plant stem. This one is a cross section through a conifer twig. And then we just have areas where we just have a whole bunch of different plant material overlapping itself. And it can really tell us a good idea of what the actual animal was eating. The really cool detail with this is that it's amazingly well preserved. So here's 4 different examples. This is leaf cuticle. This is the surface of the leaf. And you can see cells, and you can see those little pairs of dark brown things. Those are guard cells that surround stomata. Those are the openings in the leaves that open and close to allow gas exchange during photosynthesis. Just to show you what what these look like with modern leaves, the preservation is actually mind-blowing. The first time we looked at the microscope, we couldn't believe it. We also have a variety of these things. These are called sporangia, and sporangia are basically sac-like organs that hold the spores of things like ferns. And these are great because these can be diagnostic to different types of ferns. So let's compare these to what we see with modern ferns. So first off, if you take a fern leaf and you turn it over, you see all those brown rough circles. Those are called sori. And each of those will be composed of dozens or hundreds of these sporangia. And at the bottom, you can see what modern sporangia look like compared to some of these from the Cretaceous. So really exceptional preservation. And we don't just have 1 or 2 of these things, we have hundreds of these things and multiple different morphotypes. So we can actually get an idea of the different types of plants that are eaten and maybe an idea of the relative abundance of those different plants. So if we break down that plant tissue into what it actually consists of, about 88% of it is leaf tissue. This is not surprising. This makes sense. This is most of what we would expect from an herbivorous dinosaur to be eating. And there's great examples of this. We can see cross sections through leaves where you can see individual cells. We have those sporangia with multiple different morphotypes. And then again, we have those cuticle. We have the plant leaf surfaces. And you can see there's different shapes of cells, different shapes of guard cells. And we can trace these back and figure out what types of plants these came from. We also have things that aren't leaves that are also in there. We have a variety of stems from different plants, and some of these are more diagnostic than others. We have quite a bit of wood as well. And then we have quite a bit of charcoal or fusinite. This is wood that was burnt before it was consumed by the animal, which is a bit of a puzzle. We can look at the relative distribution of those tissues across the different slides, and we can see that there's variation, but the pattern is pretty consistent. That tells us that we are getting a good idea of what was actually sampled, at least in that one point in time that we're sampling from the stomach. The next stage is to figure out not just what types of tissues these come from, but what types of plants. And some of those epithelial cells, some of those sporangia are much more diagnostic. So if we actually figure out where these are coming from, about 85% of the material in the gut that can be identified is from ferns. About 3% is from cycads, and there's some trace conifer content, but it's almost 90% ferns, which is really strong evidence for a bias towards ferns. Now, knowing what the animal ate is one thing, but knowing what it was available for it to eat and what it did and did not eat is entirely different. So we also wanted to compare what was growing in the environment, what was available that the animal could have eaten, but didn't eat in preference for something else. So to that, we again collaborated with our paleobotanist colleagues and looked at the Gates Formation, which is a formation from the same time that our dinosaur comes from, and approximately the same place. Remember, our dinosaur was found out at sea, so we don't know exactly where it came from on the landscape, but this is the best guess. And we can look at the relative abundance of different types of plants, things like angiosperms, conifers, and ginkgos. What we see is that most of these are actually fairly common in that formation. Angiosperms are quite rare, though. They're just getting started. And if we compare that relative abundance to the relative abundance in the gut, we really see that the abundance is for the ferns. We know that conifers, ginkgos, cycads, and horsetails were abundant in the formation. They were probably accessible to the animal, but it didn't seem to eat them in any great deal. It really seemed to prefer ferns. And it preferred certain types of ferns. We do know that there was ferns that were present in that formation based on both these macrofossils and based on pollen in the animal's stomach that it didn't seem to eat. So in some cases, it was actually a very picky eater. And this kind of makes sense. If you're a big herbivorous dinosaur that needs to eat a large amount of food to keep that metabolism going, you're probably going to eat what's really available. And ferns were the dominant plant at that time. So it kind of makes sense, but it gives us some really good, solid, direct evidence for what these animals were eating, and we can start looking at what was their ecology from there. And I want to highlight two kind of really cool aspects that I didn't expect going in. The first is I want to go back to that charcoal, that fusinite. Again, this is wood that was burnt before it was consumed by the animal. And this was a bit of a puzzle initially, but then we got thinking about it. And if you look at research on wildfires back in the Cretaceous, there's actually really good evidence that the early Cretaceous of North America, those conifer-dominated forests saw very common, very frequent forest fires run through them, and that's what's producing this charcoal, this burnt wood material that gets fossilized. And if you are a nodosaur, if you're an ankylosaur that's low to the ground, and your favorite food is ferns, you can't reach a lot of those conifers in the trees, and they block out a lot of light. But if a forest fire comes through, some of the small plants like the ferns really get a chance to get going. This is called succession. It's post-forest fire succession. And if you're a nodosaur, this is kind of the best buffet you can go to, because not only do you have a huge abundance of ferns, but the ferns that you have available are they're new growth, and they have a much higher nutrient content than some of the old growth. And while you're munching away on some of these ferns, you're probably also ingesting some of that charcoal into your diet as well, and that's getting preserved and giving some hints about your ecology. Now, this seems like a bit of a weird interaction, but it's actually quite common today. There's a lot of modern herbivores that will seek out recently burned areas, both in savannas or grasslands or fires, to make use of different plants that are growing there in heightened abundance following the fire. So what this might be is actually the earliest evidence of this type of animal forest fire interaction in terms of herbivory, which is really cool. So we work with various paleoartists, in this case, very talented paleoartist Julius Cittoni, and we wanted him to recreate the landscape, both in terms of the plants that were living at the time. Here you can see a variety of ferns and cycads and conifers. All of these are plants that lived in that formation. And then what the animal is eating is actually reflective of what we have a good idea that actually chose to eat while it was alive. So again, getting some solid evidence for the very basics about the diet of these dinosaurs. And there's one last cool tidbit, which I think is one of the coolest aspects of this, is that it's actually quite a far ways north. Back in the Cretaceous, it was actually further north. So right now, the site's about 57 degrees north. Back in the early Cretaceous, it was 65 degrees north, so even further north. What that means is that even though the climate was entirely different, we didn't have polar ice caps, we didn't have the same winter that we have here in terms of cold, there would have been a winter in terms of how much sunlight was received on any given day during the season. So you would have had a summer that would have had very long seasons of sunlight and a winter that would have had very short growing periods. And the plants would have responded as such. And those plants can actually give us an idea about what season this event happened. If we look at, for instance, those bits of wood, we can look at the growth rings and we can see that the final growth ring, the expanded part, the fast growing part is preserved, but we don't see the really slow growing part that we would see in the slow growing part of the season. We can look at those sporangia, those basically those sacs that hold the spores. And we know that the spores are mature, they're ready to go, but the sporangium is intact. That annulus, basically a little spring that releases those spores, that hasn't been released yet. So these are ready to go and spread their spores. We can also look at things like the fact that there's cycad pollen, but not cycad leaf fragments in the gut. And all of these things together, we can reconstruct that this animal would have eaten this last meal sometime in kind of the late spring to midsummer in this Cretaceous paleo landscape. So not only can we learn about its diet and its environment, we can actually put a season on that, which I'm quite surprised that we can actually get those details from this exquisite specimen. So with that, I need to thank a lot of different collaborators because although I'm talking today, this research was very collaborative. We had lots of different people collaborating and helping out, helping with their various expertise. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
So thank you both Francois and Caleb for joining me this evening and for sharing your very interesting research with everyone. I know that many of you probably have questions. I see some questions coming in. So if you do have questions, just please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we appreciate all your questions, but please just be advised that due to limited time, we may not be able to answer all of them. So I believe this question is directed to Dr. Brown. Do you get any DNA preserved in your fossil samples? And that's from Bob.
Okay, great question. We get this question all the time. We don't get DNA. DNA is very volatile, has a very short half-life, so it disappears quite quickly. What we are discovering, though, is that the proteins that the DNA codes for are often preserved, or at least the byproducts of those proteins. So there's a whole area of molecular paleontology that is specifically focused on the preservation of soft tissues. And this is a very new area of paleontology. We used to say everything was replaced and all the organics are gone. And now the more we look for it, the more we find things like proteins, the more we find things like pigments. but DNA is still something that we haven't been able to get from dinosaurs. It just doesn't last very long.
Great, thank you. Another question directed at Dr. Brown is, how big is this dinosaur that you were describing?
Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. The size of the dinosaur, it would have been in life about 5.5 or 6 meters long, and it would have weighed about 1.5 tons or 2 tons. So quite sizable. And some of those spikes, for instance, the spike on the shoulder, that's about 1/2 meter long. So it's not a small animal by any means.
Thank you. This question, I think, is probably directed at Dr. Tyrrien. And someone is wondering, did dinosaurs have a sense of smell?
Yes, all animals have a sense of smell. The part of the brain that's responsible for the sense of smell is called the olfactory bulbs. And in some theropods with Dr. Zawanitsky, we've done research looking at the size, the relative size of the olfactory bulbs in various meat-eating dinosaurs to figure out how well developed the sense of smell was, going with the assumption that a larger olfactory bulb would mean a better developed sense of smell. And we found that some theropods, some meat-eating dinosaurs had a very keen sense of smell, and maybe not surprisingly, those were the Tyrannosaurs and the Raptors. So these animals seem to have had a good sense of smell. Now, what was it for? We can't say if it was for because they were scavengers or they were predators. In modern animals, usually a better sense of smell corresponds to being active maybe at night when eyesight is not very good, or when you patrol a large territory, you have a large home range, then you rely more on olfactive cues, on smell to patrol, to know where you are. So we found that, yes, some meat-eating dinosaurs had very keen sense of smell. Some had very poor sense of smell, like ostrich mimic dinosaurs and cassowary-like dinosaurs. Those had large eye sockets, had large eyeballs. So presumably, at least we assume that maybe they were more visual animals. And then you have some theropods. Most theropods were average, maybe slightly, a sense of smell slightly less developed than that of modern alligators. But modern alligators have a very keen sense of smell. They can smell carrion up to 2 or 3 kilometers away. So saying that a theropod has a poor sense of smell than an alligator is not is not saying that they have a bad sense of smell. It's just alligators have a very good sense of smell.
Great, thank you. Another question directed at Dr. Brown. Is charcoal found in the stomachs of modern animals?
Yes, so that's a great question. We do find charcoal in the stomachs of some modern animals, and there's 2 reasons why it gets there. The first reason is it's kind of accidentally consumed. It's an animal feeding, as I explained it, in an area where there's been a forest fire or some other event, and while it's munching on other material, that charcoal gets ingested. There are some animals that intentionally consume charcoal as well. And charcoal does have some detoxification properties. And it's actually also used in some livestock purposes as well, feeding charcoal to some animals. In this case, we think the best explanation is that it wasn't choosing to eat the charcoal, but that it was incidental. Either way, it doesn't really matter because it would still be in an area where there must have been a fire to have the charcoal available. So we're still not sure what that motivation was, but I think the best idea is that it was kind of just accidentally picked up. Great,
thank you. Again, directed at Dr. Brown, were you able to determine the cause of death of the specimen you described?
So the specimen is amazingly well preserved. But we only have the front half of it. We don't have the back half. So we can exclude some causes of death. We know it didn't die of starvation because it had a stomach full of plant material. It didn't show any obvious signs of trauma from a large carnivore. There wasn't bite marks or big chunks of flesh missing or anything like that, at least for the parts that we have. It was found in a marine environment. And it had to get there somehow. Now it could have been transported out into the ocean after it died, which is entirely possible. It could have also died in a flood and been transported out at the same time. So that's one hypothesis, but there's also many others that could have explained how it died. So we can eliminate a few possibilities, but it's still an open question as to exactly what killed this animal.
Great, thank you. This question here, I think it's potentially directed at Dr. Tyrrien. It's related to extinction. Can you tell us what extent the Siberian or Deccan or other traps were connected to the Permian and other extinctions? And that's from Mike.
Yes, that's a good question. Lots of big mass extinctions have been linked to different events in Earth's history, one of them being volcanic eruptions or volcanism. And I think there's a pretty strong case that has been made by colleagues at the Department of Geoscience and at the Geological Survey of Canada in Calgary, that basically the Siberian traps were probably directly linked to the Permo-Triassic extinction, because all the basalts would have flowed on top of, I think, lots of coal debris, and would have released lots of mercury and sulfur in the atmosphere and changed the climate of the planet and led to oceanic acidification as well. For the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, what we call the Kpg boundary, that is where dinosaurs went extinct, there the link is more difficult to establish, because determining the exact timing of the eruption for the Deccan traps, the volcanic eruptions in India that are more or less coincident with the Kpg boundary, is up for debate. For the longest time, we thought that the volcanic eruptions had started before the extinction and then could have potentially altered climate, maybe even poisoned the atmosphere, released lots of sulfur, and led to the extinction. But now the latest studies seem to show that volcanic eruptions, the Deccan volcanic eruptions, started just before the meteorite impact, but the vast majority of the Deccan volcanism actually happened after the extinction of the dinosaurs and the meteorite impact. So now the link between volcanic eruptions and the extinction of dinosaurs is very tenuous, because the timing doesn't match. So I think the case for the extinction of dinosaurs is probably due that we know that there was very dramatic and very severe climatic changes before the extinction of the dinosaurs. The climate was on a roller coaster ride, going through very warm to very cold. And just before the impact, there was a very sudden drop in temperatures of about 8 degrees Celsius on a global scale. And that's at that time that the meteorite impact occurred. So I think that probably volcanic eruptions may not have been a big contributor to the extinction of dinosaurs, but I think that climate change combined with the devastating consequences of the meteorite impact, those two factors are probably responsible for the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction.
Great, thank you. And we have another question for you, Dr. Therrien. Teddy, who is in grade 3, he asks the question, what herbivore has the strongest bite force?
That's a very good question, to which I don't have the answer, because I usually work on predators. For plant eaters, because you don't have to bite hard onto a prey. If you're feeding on leaves, like what Dr. Brown showed, if you're chewing on leaves, the leaves are very soft, so you don't necessarily need a whole lot of bite force. It's only if you try to bite on something hard, that's when you need a stronger bite. And so we know, for example, Ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs that Caleb mentioned, seem to have very weak teeth, very weak jaws, and it goes with what the results of his study show, that if it's chewing on fern leaves, then you probably don't need a very hard bite. But for other theropods, other plant eaters, I'm not quite sure which ones. There's been different studies using computer modeling to try to figure out which animals had the strongest bite in terms of plant eaters. But I must admit that, I'm not familiar with which species or which type of plant eaters would have the stronger bite. But maybe Caleb has an idea. Unfortunately, I don't.
Yeah, there's been a little bit of biomechanical work I haven't done any of it personally. I would guess that the ceratopsians would probably be a good candidate. So the horned dinosaurs, they have a very powerful shearing dentition. So they might have been able to eat some very hard resistant material, but I'm not sure.
Great, thank you. So another question I think could go to either of you. Why is it so rare to find preserved tendons and soft tissue in dinosaurs?
I'll let Caleb handle that.
Sure, I can handle this. Finding preserved tendons is actually not that rare. There are several groups of dinosaurs that they do what they make ossified tendons. So basically they turn their tendon into bone. It becomes stiff while the animal is alive and inflexible. And chemically, it's very similar to bone. So when the animal dies, there's a good chance that those ossified tendons will be treated the same way as bones and be fossilized. In terms of other soft tissue, it's quite rare, but the more we look for it, the more we're finding it. And sometimes it just takes, you just have to look at it the right way to actually see what's there. If you're not looking for it, you often miss it. It also really depends on the depositional environment. So the more quiet an animal bird in a very high energy environment is going to have a poorer chance to get soft tissues preserved. So on a fast flowing river, for example. But if you're being preserved in like a lake bed with very fine sediments, there's a good chance of fossilization. So it's not equal across the board as well. But one of the reasons we're finding them more is just because we're looking for them more nowadays.
Great, thank you. We have another question from a young viewer. Rylan is asking how fast a Troodon can run.
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at Troodon specifically. There's been reconstructions based on the length of the legs and potential muscle reconstructions for ostrich mimic dinosaurs. And we know that those animals were quite fast, could have possibly ran as fast as ostriches. But for Troodon, that's a smaller meat eater. Based on the skeleton, it's very lightly built. It seems to be very agile. So it probably would have been a fast runner, but coming up with a speed estimate, like how fast could it actually run, I don't think a study on that animal has been done before. Sometimes you can estimate even speed based on the footprints on trackways. You can see the spacing between feet, and then you can estimate from that what would have been the walking speed or the running speed of an animal. But as far as I know, no trackways for a Troodon has ever been discovered. So that's a mystery that maybe will be solved with future fossil discoveries.
And I think you touched on this or maybe answered it already, Dr. Brown, but David asks, how did the plant eating dinosaur specimen end up on the ocean floor?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and we get that quite a bit. So first off, the animal was not in its normal environment. It would not have been living in that area. It was transported in at some point. We don't know if it was alive when that happened, if it was caught up in a flood and drowned and got transported, or if it died from some other circumstance and then was transported out. There's the possibility that it was involved with a flood. What happens to an animal after it dies and is in water, it goes through a process called bloat and float. And that is where basically as the animal starts to rot, gases build up. And especially with ankylosaurs, they tend to flip over because they have armor on the back and they have this bloated belly. And it would have floated out to sea in that situation. And eventually it would have burst and sank to the bottom and been covered quite rapidly in those fine sediments. And that's why it's so well preserved. But the actual mechanism in terms of how it got transported out there, we're not sure. It looks like it was several, possibly hundreds of kilometers from shore. So it did travel quite a ways.
Thank you, Caleb. Another question from Tom Gallagher. For Dr. Brown, where was the Cretaceous sea level at the time of the death of your armored dinosaur?
So I didn't show any paleogeographic maps, unfortunately, but the sea level would have been higher than it is now. You would have had this large seaway in the middle of North America, and this seaway would have come and go throughout the Cretaceous. In this case, the seaway is called the Boreal Sea, but later on, a couple million years, it would have kind of cut North America all the way in half, even called the Western Interior Seaway. That seaway is one of the reasons why we get so many well-preserved dinosaurs here in Alberta, is that this was a very lush, wet landscape with a high abundance of dinosaurs. And then you also had lots of rivers coming through with lots of deposition. So when the animals died, there was a good chance that they could get buried either in kind of river sediments or in marine sediments, and then get fossilized and exposed in the Badlands today.
Sure. And he also asks, Thomas Gallagher, why was the preservation so good in your prize fossil?
There's a couple of reasons why we get really good preservation. The first is that you need very rapid burial. So the time between when the animal was munching on its last fern meal and when it died and was buried was probably very short, probably in the matter of days, because otherwise things start to decompose very quickly. The other thing is that it was buried, must have been buried very rapidly, and it was probably buried in an environment that had very low oxygen, which would have deterred a lot of scavenging and a lot of other activity that would have broken up the skeleton. There's a specific layer in the Wabasca member of the Clearwater Formation called the glauconitic layer. It's this kind of, I think it's 3 meters thick. And that one layer that has lots of glauconite, we tend to get, that's where we get most of our articulated marine reptiles from, things like Ichthyosaurs and Plesiosaurs. So there's something environmentally or geochemically about that layer which is really helpful to exceptional preservation of these specimens, and that's where this particular specimen was found.
Great, thank you. And I think this is directed at Dr. Therrien. What was the function of the very small forelimbs on some of these theropod dinosaurs? And that's from Anne.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there's always, it's a question we often get, why did T-Rex have such puny little forelimbs? And that was also the case for the Ebillosaurids. And there's no clear answer. It's probably related to what we call a factor of allometry, the way different body parts grow relative to others. And I think that the reason why the forelimbs in some theropods shrank down in size is because they were no longer being used. They were their function, the purpose they had was being used by some other part. For example, in the case of T-Rex, I think since Tyrannosaurs had started using their jaws as their killing methods, their forelimbs probably no longer had a reason for being, or at least they would still be used for some reason, maybe for scratching or something, but they were no longer the main weapon used associated with capturing prey. That had been taken off by the skull. So I think that's why it freed up the limbs to evolve in their own directions. And because there was no more evolutionary selective pressures to favor very long forelimbs, they just start going down in length through evolutionary time to a point where they became essentially vestigial structures. So structures that used to have a function, but over time they got smaller and smaller. And we still see, for example, some snakes today have vestigial hind limbs. They're tiny little spines on the back of the snake. Those are vestigial limbs. Some whales have vestigial hip bones buried inside their body cavities. There are remains of their distant ancestors which had limbs at some point. So I think that's the answer for the shrinking forelimbs, is that they're vestigial structures that were used for something in a distant ancestor, but because their function has been taken over by another part of the body, they were free to actually start shrinking in size.
We have another question, I think, for you, Dr. Therrien. from last month's Gallagher speaker, Fran. And she asks, did all Albertan dinosaurs die out after the impact? And if not, which ones survived?
That's a good question. Well, the thing with Alberta dinosaurs is they did not all live at the same time. In Alberta, we have a good fossil record for the last, I'd say maybe 15 million years of the Cretaceous. So some species, dinosaur species usually last a couple million years, and then they're usually extinct and are replaced by other species. But when we look at the very last species that lived on Alberta, that includes Triceratops, T-Rex, Ankylosaurus, and Leptoceratops, lots of other animals. These, as far as we can tell, based on the fossil record, they all lived up to the day of the impact, the very last day of the Cretaceous. And as far as we can tell, no dinosaurs survived into what's called the Paleogene, the beginning of the age of mammals. And that seems to be the case everywhere around the world. We haven't found fossils of dinosaurs, at least. There's some dinosaur bones that have been found in early Paleogene deposits, but those have all been shown to have been reworked. They had been buried during Cretaceous time, but then a river after the extinction came, eroded the sediment, and then the fossils of dinosaurs were just remobilized and reburied into more recent deposits. But as far as we can tell, no dinosaurs survived into the Paleogene anywhere around the world.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And this is to Dr. Brown. What could have ignited all the forest fires mentioned in the presentation during the Cretaceous?
The most likely candidate for igniting the forest fires would be the same candidates that cause a lot of forest fires today, which is lightning is the biggest one. There might have been other causes as well, but I think lightning would be my number one candidate for causing these fires.
Great, thank you. And one other question. Verita, age 9, wants to know which dinosaur has eaten a T-Rex.
Well, we know from evidence that basically T-Rex sometimes ate other T-Rex because we have evidence of scavenging on some T-Rex bones. So basically tooth marks that were left by the scavenger when it came and scavenged a carcass of a T-Rex. And the tooth marks match the teeth of another T-Rex. So we know for a fact, we have fossil evidence that T-Rex was a cannibalistic species, that it could eat other members of its species. It's also possible there could have been there at the same time as T-Rex. We had also small raptors that were around, small troodontids. So it's possible that those smaller species could have scavenged on a carcass of a dead T-Rex. I don't think they would have gone after a live T-Rex. It would have been basically suicide. But basically, once the T-Rex was dead, it's quite likely that some of the smaller predators could have come and scavenged on a T-Rex. But if they didn't scratch the bones with their teeth to leave tooth marks, then yeah, we will never know. But it wouldn't be surprising if some of the smaller theropod species came and fed on the carcass of a dead T-Rex.
So that was our last question. I just want to say thank you to everyone for their questions. It's been a pleasure being here with you tonight during this event and being able to participate in this Gallagher presentation.
All right. First of all, thank you very much to Drs. Zawanitsky, Therrien, and Brown for your wonderful presentations this evening. That was fantastic to witness. Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Clarkson. I'm a professor in the Department of Geoscience. I wanted to say how much I've enjoyed being part of the Gallagher series over the past few years. Tonight's presentation is an example of how this series supports our own world-class researchers and their work. As noted previously, this is the last Gallagher event that I'll formally be involved with. Although I'm confident that this series is in great hands with Dr. Ben Tulo and this wonderful team from the Faculty of Science who have been so helpful to me. For me personally, this was the ideal event to finish on, not only because of the fantastic science that we heard about tonight, but because of one of my great colleagues, Dr. Darla Zawanitsky, being involved in the event. Thanks for being involved in this one, Darla. I really appreciate it. I'd like to take just a moment and personally thank the Gallagher family for their ongoing support of this public series. I've had the privilege of getting to know Tom and Fred Gallagher over the past few years. And I enjoyed every moment of our discussions about the series and of course about science, both of which those gentlemen are very well educated. Thanks you guys for being such champions of science and of science education. Our students, faculty, and staff and alumni have all been made richer by being able to learn from world-class researchers and scientists that have been a part of this series over the past few years. If you're interested in supporting our research or any other faculty initiatives, please visit our faculty website at science.ucalgary.ca. Additionally, there will be a link included in the post-event survey that you can follow. I'd like to remind you that our series will resume on Thursday, January the 21st, 2021. Dr. Susan Brantley from Penn State University will talk about how fracking affects our water. Look for registration details in your inbox or by checking out our website at science.ucalgary.ca. Before that, of course, is our the Department of Geoscience is hosting the Tom Oliver Lecture with invited speaker Dr. Peter Kellerman, who will talk about CO2 capture and storage via carbon mineralization. Save the date and plan to register when you receive the email invitation. We're looking forward to that as well. Lastly, when you see our event survey in your inbox, please take care, or take a moment, I should say, to fill out. The link to give will be included in the survey in case you're interested in doing so. Your feedback is important and we want to hear from you for sure. Again, thank you all for attending tonight. It was a wonderful event. I really enjoyed it personally. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night, everybody.